I consequently find each accused person guilty of the offense of murder, contrary to Section 203 of the Penal Code, as charged in Count 1.
Imagine waiting 8 years. 8 years just to hear one word. Guilty. Not because the killer disappeared, not because investigators had no leads, but because the man accused of orchestrating the murder was one of the most powerful politicians in Kenya. A governor, a husband, a father, a man who insisted he had nothing to do with the death of a 26-year-old university student carrying his child. For years, Kenyans asked, would justice ever come? On July 23, 2026, Justice Cecilia Githua finally answered that question, and what she revealed was far more disturbing than many people imagined. This is the story of Sharon Otieno.
Twisted tales in every folder. Truth runs hot while the trail gets colder. Crime dopers, we don't look away.
Hello crime dopers, I'm Wanja. Thank you for joining me for another episode where crime meets truth. Today's story is one many Kenyans have followed since 2018, a story that sparked protest, headlines, political debates, questions about power, gender-based violence, and whether justice can truly reach those at the top. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge something. This episode discusses violence against women and the murder of a young mother-to-be. If that's difficult for you, please take care of yourself. Now, let's rewind to where it all began. Because before Sharon Otieno became the center of one of Kenya's biggest murder trials, she was simply a young woman trying to build a future. Sharon Otieno was only 26 years old. She was a student at Toronto University. Friends described her as ambitious, confident, and determined to create a better life. Like many university students, she dreamed big. No one could have imagined that her name would one day become known across the entire country. Now, here's where the story becomes complicated. Sometime in early 2018, Sharon began a relationship with the then Migori Governor Okoth Obado. At the time, Obado wasn't just another politician. He was one of the most influential leaders in Western Kenya. Power, money, political connections. He had all of it. According to evidence later presented in court, their relationship eventually resulted in Sharon becoming pregnant, and that pregnancy changed everything. Because unlike an ordinary relationship, this one carried enormous political consequences. Obado was married. He was serving as governor. An affair becoming public could seriously damage his reputation. And according to the court findings years later, that fear became the motive prosecutors would rely on to explain everything that followed. But here's something people sometimes overlook. This wasn't simply about a relationship. It became a battle over what Sharon wanted. Court evidence later showed she wanted acknowledgement, recognition, support. She was carrying a child, and she wanted the father to accept responsibility. The prosecution argued that instead, pressure began mounting. Investigators told the court there were attempts to persuade Sharon to terminate the pregnancy. Justice Githua ultimately accepted evidence that Obado had offered Sharon money, about 30,000 Kenyan shillings, to procure an abortion, a fact the court cited as part of the motive and planning behind the crime. Now pause for a second. Imagine being 26, pregnant, trying to figure out your future, then realizing the father of your child is one of the country's most powerful politicians. What do you do? Do you stay silent? Do you walk away? Or do you insist on being heard? Those questions will soon place Sharon directly in the path of unimaginable danger. And the clock had already started ticking. As tension grew, Sharon reportedly considered exposing the relationship publicly. According to the court, there was concern that photographs and details of the affair could become public. threatening Obado's political standing. That decision changed the trajectory of the case because journalists became involved. One of them was Nation Media Group reporter Barack Oduor. His assignment? Help document Sharon's story. Think about that for a moment. Neither Sharon nor Barack were investigating a murder. They were preparing to expose what they believed was a matter of public interest. They thought they were heading toward an interview. Instead, they were walking into what prosecutors will later describe as a carefully coordinated trap. And that brings us to September 3rd, 2018, a date Kenya will never forget. September 3rd started like many ordinary days. There were phone calls, messages, plans. According to prosecutors, Sharon was told there will be a meeting, one final discussion, an opportunity to resolve everything. Barack accompanied her. Having a journalist present probably made the meeting feel safer. After all, who would attack someone in the company of a reporter? But here's the chilling part. The court later found that this meeting had been carefully coordinated. Justice Githua concluded that Michael Oyamo, Obado's personal assistant, played a central role in arranging Sharon's movements while Caspal Obiero handled logistics. What Sharon thought was a meeting, the prosecution said, was actually an ambush. The pair arrived in Rongo, then suddenly, everything changed. Instead of a peaceful discussion, armed men emerged. Sharon and Barack were forced into a vehicle, abducted. No warning, no chance to call for help. Imagine the confusion inside that car. Sharon, pregnant, trying to understand what was happening. Barack realizing this wasn't intimidation anymore. This was something far worse. Then came one of the most remarkable moments in this entire case. Barack made a decision that almost certainly saved his life. He fought. He forced open the vehicle and he jumped from a moving car. Think about the desperation that takes. You don't leap from a speeding vehicle unless you believe staying inside is even more dangerous. Bruised and injured, he escaped. Sharon did not. And that raises one haunting question. What happened during the rest of that journey? Because from that moment onward, no one outside that vehicle would ever hear Sharon Otieno's voice again.
I suggested that we have a meeting at a hotel called Grasha. Then we saw two men standing by the roadside. Sigari ka park sideways. Venye amefungua tu mlango hivi, mtu mmoja akaingia pali pake venye alikaa next to Sharon. Mtu mwingine akakuja akanishongeza forcefully hivi akafunga mlango, gari ikatoka. Gari ikatoka few meters, ndio akasema they started with me eti funga simu yako. These guys had weapons. And the other guy who was sitting next to Sharon was asking her, how have you known this guy? And the court driver was saying, you guys have ever wanted to see the governor. We are taking you to see him. You do not need to get worried. Those ones were the last conversations before I jumped out of the moving car.
In the next chapter, we follow the final journey to Kodera forest. We'll examine what investigators uncovered at the crime scene, how a taxi driver's testimony became one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence, and why a web of phone records, vehicle tracking data, and witness accounts would eventually convince the High Court that this murder was planned long before Sharon entered that vehicle. The silence must have been terrifying. Picture this. It's evening. You're inside a vehicle with men you don't know. One person has already escaped. You're 7 months pregnant, and you have no idea where you're being taken. As investigators will later piece together the events, Sharon's final journey led toward Kodera Forest, a quiet, isolated area straddling Homa Bay and Migori counties. Far away from crowds, far away from witnesses, exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear. Now, here's something that many people don't realize. For years, the prosecution's case wasn't based on one dramatic piece of evidence. It was built like a puzzle. Every phone call, every vehicle movement, every witness statement, every lie, every small inconsistency, each one became another piece of the bigger picture. And one of the people who unknowingly became part of that picture was a taxi driver. His name was Jackson Otieno Gombe. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a police officer, he wasn't even connected to Sharon. He was simply a driver. According to his testimony, he was instructed to drive toward a secluded area near Kodera. He recalled being told to switch off the vehicle's headlights. Think about that. Why turn off the headlights? Why choose darkness? Why leave the road altogether? Those aren't the actions of people going to resolve a disagreement. They are actions of people trying not to be seen. Gombe testified that Sharon was dragged away from the vehicle into the darkness by two men. He stayed behind, waiting, listening, unable to see exactly what was happening beyond the trees. Minutes later, the men returned, calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. They allegedly told him, "We've left her at home." But everyone in that vehicle knew that wasn't true, because no one leaves someone at home after driving them into a forest. No one asks for darkness unless they are hiding something. Now ask yourself, what was going through Sharon's mind during those final moments? Did she still believe someone would save her? Did she still think Barack had managed to alert the police? Did she hope the people around her would change their minds? Those questions only Sharon could answer, and tragically, she never got the chance.
Homa Bay.
Tulipata nguo ya white ikiwa imewekwa karibu na kichwa yake na kondom yenye imeraruliwa imewekwa hapo kando na body tu peke yake. Sisi tunaweza omba serikali watuwekee ulinzi hapa juu, vile hiyo kitu imepatikana hapa, tunaweza semekana sisi vijana wa hapa ndio wabaya tumefanya kitu kama hiyo. Sasa wafanye uchunguzi, kitu itendeke kweli ionekane.
By the following morning, hope had almost disappeared. Police and local residents continued searching for Sharon. Then the call came. Her body had been found in a secluded area near Owade, close to Kodera Forest in Homa Bay County. Nothing could have prepared investigators for what they were about to witness. Sharon was found lying in a pool of blood. Her clothing had been scattered around the scene. Nearby, investigators recovered used condoms and a sachet of illicit alcohol, silent pieces of evidence that suggested the brutality of what had unfolded in those final moments. It wasn't just a murder scene. It was a crime scene that spoke of unimaginable violence. Chief Government Pathologist Dr. Johansen Oduor later conducted the post-mortem examination. His findings painted a heartbreaking picture. The autopsy revealed clinical evidence that Sharon had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. The report also showed she had fought desperately for her life. Bruises and defensive injuries on her body indicated that she resisted her attackers with everything she had. Think about that for a moment. 7 months pregnant, outnumbered, taken to an isolated location, and still she fought. She refused to surrender without a struggle, but despite that courage, the violence continued. Dr. Oduor concluded that Sharon died from excessive bleeding after sustaining 8 targeted stab wounds. One of these wounds pierced her abdomen, ending not only her life, but also the life of the unborn child she was carrying. Years later, during the High Court judgment, Justice Cecilia Githua referred to the evidence presented throughout the trial, including witness testimony and forensic findings, and concluded that Sharon had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and brutally murdered before her body was abandoned in the forest. For investigators, this wasn't a crime of impulse. The condition of the scene suggested time, deliberation, cruelty, and for Sharon's family, the discovery marked the beginning of an 8-year journey through courtrooms, painful testimony, and relentless grief, because no parent should ever have to identify their child under those circumstances, and no family should have to wait nearly a decade for justice.
She was stabbed 3 times on the neck. She was stabbed 4 times on the back and on the left side of the abdomen. So those were total of 8 stab wounds. She also have stab wound which was on the abdomen. Went through and pierced the baby also from the abdomen to the back. Means that also the baby died because of the same injuries which Sharon sustained.
Now, remember Barack Oduor, the journalist who escaped? His testimony will become one of the prosecution's most important pieces of evidence. He described how what appeared to be a legitimate meeting suddenly turned into an abduction. He recounted the terrifying moments inside the moving vehicle, his leap to freedom, and his desperate effort to report what had happened. Without Barack's escape, investigators may have taken much longer to understand the sequence of events. Sometimes history changes because one person survives long enough to tell the story, and Barack did exactly that. But witness testimony alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed something stronger, something objective, something that couldn't forget or change its version of events. Fortunately, technology doesn't lie. One of the reasons this case became so compelling was because detectives didn't rely on confessions. They followed data, cold, unemotional, digital evidence. Let's start with the vehicle. Investigators discovered that the car allegedly used during the abduction had a tracking system installed. Normally, that tracker continuously records movement, but on the evening Sharon disappeared, something unusual happened. The tracking device suddenly went offline, just poof, disappeared. Hours later, after Sharon had already been killed, the tracker mysteriously came back online. Coincidence, right? The High Court didn't think so. Justice Cecilia Githua accepted evidence that the vehicle's tracking system had been deliberately deactivated and later reactivated, supporting the prosecution's theory that this was an intentional attempt to conceal the vehicle's movements. Now think about that. Technology can fail, but when it fails at the exact same time as a murder, investigators naturally begin asking very difficult questions. Then came another breakthrough: cell phone records. Every mobile phone leaves behind tiny digital footprints. When you make a call, send a text, or even move from one location to another, your phone communicates with nearby towers. Those records became crucial. Investigators reconstructed movements, who was where, who was communicating with whom, and when. According to the court, those records helped establish coordination between the accused and supported the prosecution's argument that the crime wasn't spontaneous, it had been organized. Again, no single phone record solved the case, but together they created a timeline that became increasingly difficult to explain away. Then investigators turned to forensic science. There had been speculation, rumors, denials, but DNA doesn't care about politics. It doesn't care about public opinion. Government analysts conducted DNA testing. The results showed with overwhelming certainty that Okoth Obado was the biological father of Sharon's unborn child. That finding didn't prove murder by itself, but it proved something equally important: motive. The relationship existed, the pregnancy existed, and suddenly, many of the earlier denials became much harder to sustain. Now imagine being an investigator. You've got witness testimony, digital evidence, financial records, phone data, DNA, vehicle tracking. Individually, each piece raises questions. Together, they tell a story. A story prosecutors believed pointed toward premeditation. But even after years of investigation, one mystery remains. The two men who physically attacked Sharon have never been identified or brought before the court. That means although the High Court found that the murder was financed planned and coordinated by those convicted, the individuals who carried out the stabbing have never faced justice. And isn't that unsettling? How can a case be solved yet still feel incomplete? How can justice move forward while some of the people who directly committed the violence remain unknown? Sometimes justice doesn't answer every question. Sometimes it simply answers the biggest one. Who bears criminal responsibility? The High Court will spend years weighing that exact question. And after hearing dozens of witnesses over nearly 8 years, Justice Cecilia Githua was finally ready to deliver her answer. In the final part of this episode, we'll step inside the courtroom. On the day the verdict was delivered, we'll unpack the judge's findings, Sharon's family's emotional reaction after waiting 8 years for justice, what happens next as the convicted men await sentencing, and the larger lessons this landmark case leaves for Kenya.
Each accused is accordingly convicted under Section 322. I consequently find each accused person guilty of the offense of murder, contrary to Section 203 of the Penal Code, as charged in Count 1. The accused persons acted in concert, jointly with others not before the court, pursuant to a common design, each performing a distinct role in furtherance of a criminal enterprise that resulted in the death of the late Sharon.
July 23rd, 2026. For nearly 8 years, this case had dominated headlines, court adjournments, witness testimony, legal arguments, cross-examinations, thousands of pages of evidence, 42 witnesses, countless hours inside the courtroom, and finally, the day had come. Inside the High Court, the atmosphere was heavy. Everyone understood that this wasn't just another judgment. It was a moment that will test whether Kenya's justice system could hold powerful people accountable. Outside, journalists gathered early. Cameras lined the court entrance. Supporters, activists, curious members of the public, Sharon's family, all waiting, all hoping, all wondering what the judge was about to say. Then Justice Cecilia Githua began reading a judgment that will take several hours. Every page mattered, every finding carried weight. The courtroom fell silent. The court reached one central conclusion. The prosecution had proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. That phrase, you've probably heard it many times. But in criminal law, those words carry enormous significance. They mean the evidence convinced the court that there was no reasonable alternative explanation consistent with innocence. Justice Githua found that although former Governor Okoth Obado was not physically present at the murder scene, the evidence established that he financed, planned, and instigated the killing of Sharon Otieno. The court also found that Michael Oyamo coordinated the operation while Caspal Obiro handled logistical support. That distinction is important. The judgment wasn't based on the allegations that Obado personally carried out the stabbing. Instead, the court applied the legal principle that a person who plans, directs, or intentionally facilitates a murder can bear criminal responsibility even if they never set foot at the crime scene. Now think about that. How often do we imagine murder cases as involving only the person holding the weapon? But criminal investigations often reveal something much larger. The planners, the coordinators, the financiers, the people making phone calls from a distance. Sometimes the person giving the order never gets blood on their hands. Yet, without that order, the crime may have never happened. According to the court, this was one of those cases. One of the strongest parts of the judgment focused on motive. The court found that Sharon's pregnancy posed a serious threat to Obado's political image. Evidence showed she was prepared to make the relationship public. Photographs, details of the affair, the pregnancy, all of it. Justice Githua concluded that this looming public exposure provided a powerful motive for eliminating Sharon. The court also relied on evidence that she had previously been pressured to terminate the pregnancy. Now, it's important to remember something. Motive alone doesn't prove murder. Lots of people have motives, very few commit crimes. That's why prosecutors spent years building every other piece of evidence. Witnesses, phone records, vehicle movements, financial links, DNA. When all of those pieces were placed together, the court concluded they formed one continuous chain, a chain that pointed toward guilt. Moments after the verdict, another significant decision followed. The judge revoked the bail terms of all 3 convicted men. No more going home, no more reporting while out on bond, no more freedom pending trial. Instead, former Governor Okoth Obado, Michael Oyamo, and Caspar Obiero were escorted from the courtroom and taken into custody to await sentencing after the court ordered pre-sentence and victim impact reports. Imagine that moment. For years they had attended court from outside prison. That afternoon they left in a prison vehicle. Sometimes justice arrives slowly, but when it arrives, life changes in an instant. If you've listened to Crime Dopers for a while, you already know something I say often. The real victims don't get to move on while the headlines disappear. For Sharon's parents, this wasn't 8 years of simply waiting for court dates. It was 8 years without their daughter, 8 birthdays, 8 Christmases, 8 Mother's Days, 8 years watching grandchildren grow up without their mother, 8 years of explaining over and over again why Sharon will never come home. No judgment, no matter how significant, can return what was lost. Justice can punish, justice can acknowledge wrongdoing, justice can affirm the truth, but justice cannot rewind time. And that's one of the hardest realities in every true crime story. Even after this conviction, there's still unanswered questions. Who are the 2 men who physically carried out the killing? Will they ever be identified? Did anyone else know what was about to happen? Could Sharon have been protected sooner? Those questions continue to linger because although this conviction resolved the question of criminal responsibility for the planning and coordination of the murder, it did not identify every individual involved in the attack itself. Sometimes justice is complete in law, but incomplete in our hearts. This case became much more than a murder trial. It forced Kenya to confront uncomfortable truths. How vulnerable are women when power is involved? How many victims stay silent because they fear who they're speaking against? What responsibility does society have to believe women before tragedy strikes? And perhaps the biggest question, how do we ensure no one ever believes they're too powerful to answer for their actions? This wasn't just Sharon's story. It became a national conversation about gender-based violence, abuse of authority, witness protection, media freedom, and the rule of law. Because remember, a journalist was also abducted that night. Had Barack Oduor not survived by jumping from that moving vehicle, this investigation might have looked very different. His courage mattered, the investigators' persistence mattered, the witnesses who testified despite fear mattered, the court's willingness to examine years of evidence mattered. Justice is rarely the work of one person. It is often the result of many people refusing to give up. You know, there's something about Sharon's story that has stayed with me long after the cameras left the courtroom. We often remember victims by the way they died, but we should remember them by the lives they lived. Before Sharon Otieno became the subject of one of Kenya's most high-profile murder trials, she was a daughter, a friend, a university student, and perhaps most importantly, she was a mother. Many people know about the unborn child she was carrying at the time of her death. What fewer people realize is that Sharon was already raising a family of her own. She had 3 young children, 1 son and 2 daughters. According to testimony from her mother, Melida Auma, Sharon had welcomed the children during a previous 4-year marriage before the marriage ended, and she later met former Migori Governor Okoth Obado. When Sharon was killed, those children didn't just lose their mother. They lost the person who was supposed to watch them grow, the person who would cheer at their graduations, celebrate their birthdays, comfort them when life became difficult. Instead, they were left with memories and questions no child should ever have to ask. Today, those 3 children are being raised by Sharon's parents, Douglas Otieno and Melida Auma. The same parents who spent nearly 8 years walking in and out of courtrooms, refusing to give up on the search for justice. Imagine carrying that burden, grieving the loss of your daughter while at the same time becoming mother and father once again to her children. Their home became more than just a place of mourning. It became a place of healing, a place where 3 young lives could still find hope, love despite unimaginable loss. No court judgment, no conviction, and no sentence can ever give those children back the mother they deserved. Justice can acknowledge wrongdoing, justice can hold people accountable, but it cannot replace bedtime stories, school visits, birthday hugs, or a mother's voice. And that's why stories like Sharon's matter. Not because they are famous, not because they made headlines, but because behind every court file, behind every exhibit, behind every legal argument, there are real people whose lives are forever changed. As this chapter closes, perhaps the greatest attribute we can pay Sharon is not to remember only how she died, but to remember who she lived for. 3 children who will spend the rest of their lives carrying her memory, and grandparents whose love ensured that even after tragedy, her children will never have to face the world alone.
The second accused facilitated execution, where the third accused ensured logistical support and concealment to avoid detection of the offense. Participation, premeditation, and intention to execute their common intention. The first accused had a very strong motive to unlawfully end Sharon's life, to ensure that his illicit affair with her was not widely publicized through the print media, in order to save himself from possible public embarrassment and reputational harm.
If today's episode reminded you of anything, let it be this. Violence doesn't always begin with weapons. Sometimes it begins with control, manipulation, threats, isolation, or believing another person's life is worth less than your reputation. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, coercion, intimidation, or threats, don't wait for the situation to escalate. Reach out to trusted family, friends, community organizations, or the appropriate authorities. Seeking help early can save lives. And here's today's Crime Doper's life rule. Power shall never place anyone above accountability, and silence shall never protect violence. If you found this episode thoughtful and respectful, please subscribe to Crime Dopers. Share this episode with someone who values truth and justice, and leave a review. It helps more people discover these stories. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe this verdict brings full justice? Or does the fact that the alleged physical attackers remain unidentified leave this chapter unfinished? Share your perspective in the comments below. I'm Wanja. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and stay alert. And remember, this is Crime Dopers, where crime meets truth. Justice begins with remembering.
Crime Dopers. We don't look away.